In 1470, in the mountains of Thessaly, Greece, 23 nuns at the convent of St. Catherine knelt in prayer, unaware that the bell ringing above them would sound for the last time. Outside, Ottoman banners burned red across the horizon. The empire that had conquered Constantinople now sought to conquer faith itself, not with swords, but with ledgers, seals, and decrees. They came not to kill, but to erase, to turn souls into entries, belief into rebellion. What happened next was buried for centuries, until archaeologists found their marks carved into stone beneath Topkapi Palace. If you value the truth of history, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The air over Thessaly carried no wind that morning. The silence felt deliberate, as if nature itself had paused to witness the last moment of a world being catalogued. For nearly 1,000 years, the bell of St. Catherine had measured time, the rhythm of devotion, the structure of life. It had survived earthquakes, famine, and the slow decay of empire. Its tolling was the sound of continuity, the pulse of a civilization that believed sound could hold chaos at bay. But no institution survives an empire that learns to manage belief. The Ottoman army that advanced through Greece did not resemble the conquerors of legend. Its soldiers marched with ledgers, not torches. Its generals traveled with scribes and translators. Their weapons were definitions. What they brought was not war, but record-keeping, the transformation of theology into data. In this system, salvation was measured in obedience, and holiness translated into productivity. The empire no longer expanded through destruction. It expanded through definition. Every captured territory became an entry in a master ledger. A church was reclassified property. A priest was a local representative under new jurisdiction. A bell was an unregulated instrument of assembly. When the first cannon fired toward St. Catherine's convent, it was not an act of hatred but of policy. The shot was precise, deliberate, aimed directly at the bell tower. When the bronze cracked, the echo across the valley was both a sound and an announcement. The last voice of resistance had been archived. To understand what happened to these women, you have to understand the machine that consumed them. 17 years before the fall of St. Catherine's, in 1453, Constantinople had fallen. The jewel of Christendom, the city that had stood for 1,000 years, was gone in 53 days of cannon fire and blood. When the walls broke, so did an age. The Hagia Sophia, once the greatest cathedral in the world, was stripped of its crosses before the dust had even settled. Mosaics were plastered over, bells melted down. Within a week, the call to prayer echoed from domes where hymns had risen for 9 centuries. In the nave of that ancient church, Sultan Mehmed stood where emperors once knelt and declared it a mosque. He didn't need another place of worship. He needed a symbol, because Mehmed understood something most conquerors never did. You don't defeat a people by killing them. You defeat them by erasing who they were. The Ottomans didn't just conquer land. They conquered identity. Every city that fell became not just a victory of arms, but an act of redefinition. When Mehmed looked west, toward the broken shards of the Byzantine world, he didn't see enemies. He saw unfinished work. Every bell that still rang, every monastery that still stood, every cross that still cast a shadow was a wound that refused to close. And each nun who still prayed in Latin was a living rebellion, a reminder that faith could outlast empire. So the Sultan made a decision. If they would not convert, they would disappear. Not through massacre. Massacre creates martyrs, and martyrs create stories. Songs are written, names remembered, and blood becomes seed. No, the Ottomans had perfected something far more elegant. Erasure. To erase is to kill memory itself. And by 1470, that strategy had already spread like ink through every province of the empire. Greek monasteries in Morea, Serbian convents in the Balkans, Armenian churches in Anatolia. Each was a page rewritten. Some were burned, others quietly converted, and the rest abandoned to rot until no one remembered they had ever been there. But the pattern was always the same. First came the offer, the illusion of mercy. Then came the silence. The convent of St. Catherine, perched on its lonely hillside in Thessaly, far from any garrison or ally, was simply next on the list. Another test case, another experiment in controlled disappearance. Yet the women inside didn't know they were footnotes. They weren't warriors, they weren't rebels. They were women who had spent their entire lives in prayer and silence, believing devotion could hold back the tide. Their weapons were rosaries, their armor was faith. Most had never even seen a soldier. Sister Elani had been abbess for 12 years. Before that, she tended the sick in a village that no longer existed, a place erased by plague in 1448. She came to the convent not to hide from the world, but to try to understand it. Sister Magdalena was 19. Her hands still calloused from her father's farm. She had joined 2 years earlier. After her family was killed in a raid, the convent had been her only refuge, the one place where she felt untouched by chaos. Sister Theodorus was 70, older than most remembered kings. She had outlived 2 abbesses, an emperor, and more wars than she could count. She no longer feared death. She only feared forgetting. These were not soldiers, and this was not a battlefield. It was a sanctuary, about to be repurposed into an exhibit of obedience. By dawn, the empire had come for them. The first cannonball hit just after sunrise. It didn't strike the chapel. It struck the bell tower. The sound was apocalyptic. Stone exploded into the air. Iron shrieked against iron. The bell that had rung every morning for 140 years shattered mid-swing, raining fragments across the courtyard where the sisters grew herbs for healing. The same hands that once tended wounds now covered ears. Dust, smoke, prayer, all rose together. And in that chaos, Sister Elani did not scream. She stood in the courtyard, crucifix raised high, and began to sing, Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. One by one, the others joined her, 23 voices rising against the roar of empire. But empires don't listen to songs. By midday, the gates were breached. The Ottoman soldiers poured into the courtyard, not with swords drawn, but with ledgers, quills, and inkpots. They moved through the convent like clerks, not conquerors, counting, recording, cataloguing, because to the Ottomans, these women weren't enemies, they were assets. A translator steps forward. His robe is torn, his hands ink-stained. A Greek man conscripted by necessity, not loyalty. He unrolls a parchment sealed with the Sultan's emblem and begins to read aloud, voice trembling, by order of Sultan Mehmed II. All subjects of the conquered territories must submit to the authority of the sublime state. Those who convert shall be granted protection. Those who refuse shall face the consequences of rebellion. The words echo off the chapel's cracked stone walls. The nuns stand motionless, faces lit by the fractured sunlight streaming through the shattered bell tower. Their prayers have fallen silent, replaced by a tension older than the empire itself. The tension between obedience and conviction. Sister Elani steps forward. Dust clings to her robe. Blood stains the hem. Her voice, when she speaks, is soft but steady. Tell your Sultan, we have already given our lives to a king. We have nothing left to surrender. The translator hesitates. His lips twitch, as if searching for another word, something that might save both her and himself. But there is no translation for defiance. Not in Ottoman, not in any language of empire. Hassan Pasha, the officer in charge, listens without interruption. His face betrays no anger, only curiosity. When the translator finishes, Hassan gives a faint nod and closes his ledger. Then he smiles, not cruelly, but with the calm detachment of a man who has mastered the art of breaking resistance without raising his voice. He gestures toward the soldiers. Seal the chapel. Iron bolts slam into wood. The sound reverberates through the valley, the final punctuation of a sentence written in conquest. Inside, the air grows heavy. Hours turn to night. Outside, soldiers laugh, eat, live, waiting to see who among the sisters will break first. The empire does not hurry. Patience is its sharpest blade. Two of the younger nuns, both from Corinth, begin to sob in the darkness. Their cries echo across the walls, raw and small. But in the corner, Sister Magdalena kneels and begins to whisper a psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Her voice trembles, but it carries. The others listen. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." A second voice joins her, then a third. The prayer spreads like the first flicker of flame in a cave, and slowly the weeping stops. Outside, Hassan Pasha looks up from his tent. Hearing the faint chant beneath the laughter of his men, he says nothing. He knows this sound, the song of those who mistake faith for strength. In his letters to the Sultan, later preserved in the Topkapi archives, he would write, "Faith is like a candle. It burns brightest just before it dies." He decides to test that theory. On the second day, the doors open. A young servant enters, sets down a tray, bread and water, clean and fresh, and leaves without speaking. The sisters stare. For a moment, hunger overwhelms holiness. The younger ones glance toward Alani. Her lips are pale, but her eyes are unwavering. Sister Theodorus, the oldest, breaks the silence. "They want us to eat, to feel gratitude, to soften." Alani nods once. "Then we fast." By the third day, the room smells of sweat and iron. Their lips crack. Their throats rasp like dry reeds. The youngest faint against the wall. Still, no one touches the bread. Hassan watches from the courtyard, arms crossed, ledger open. He writes in the margins, 3 days, no submission, spirits intact, recommend escalation. He closes the book and walks to the chapel himself. The hinges shriek as the door opens. Light slices through the room. The nuns shield their eyes. Hassan enters slowly, his boots deliberate against the floor. Behind him follows the translator, silent as a shadow. "You are not criminals," Hassan begins. "You are not enemies. You are simply mistaken." His tone is gentle, almost paternal. The Sultan is merciful. He offers you new lives, new names, protection. All you must do is speak the words. Silence. He lets the quiet stretch, studying their faces. Or, he continues, "You may come with us to Constantinople. There, the Sultan himself will hear your case. Perhaps he will be moved by your conviction." He pauses, his gaze sweeping over them like a physician diagnosing a fatal condition. "But the road is long," he adds softly, "and the weak do not survive it." It is not a threat. It is a promise. Sister Elani looks to her sisters, to Magdalena, barely conscious, but still whispering prayers, to Theodorus, eyes closed in exhaustion, to the young novices who cling to one another in silence. Then she turns back to Hassan. "We will walk." The translator falters before repeating it. Hassan's smile returns, faint and clinical. "Good," he says. "We leave at dawn." That night, the sisters huddle together. No one speaks. Outside, soldiers sharpen blades they will never use. Inside, Magdalena hums the melody of a hymn, one they used to sing at Vespers. Her voice trembles, fragile, yet certain. One by one, the others join her. Their harmony rises in the dark, like smoke through the cracks of the chapel walls, drifting into the cold night. Outside, a few soldiers pause their dice games. One crosses himself quietly. Another looks away. Years later, he will tell his grandson about the women who sang themselves to death. But that story, too, will vanish, filed away under silence. When dawn comes, the doors swing open. Hassan Pasha waits in the courtyard, quill tucked behind his ear. The nuns step into the morning light, blinking, their wrists bound with rope. 23 women, no swords drawn, no cries for mercy, only the quiet shuffle of feet on dust. As they pass beneath the ruined bell tower, a shard of bronze catches the sunlight, the last fragment of the voice that once called them to prayer. The wind moves through it, and for a heartbeat, it almost sounds like the bell again, but it isn't. It's the sound of faith being recorded, and in the ledger of empire, the entry is simple: Convent of St. Catherine. Processed, the road south from Thessaly wound through fields burned to ash. The army did not march fast. It didn't need to. The empire's power lay not in speed, but in endurance, in its ability to turn even a walk into a weapon. The 23 women of St. Catherine's moved like shadows in the dust, wrists bound with rope, steps sinking into the dry soil. No horses, no carts, just the crunch of sandals against gravel, and the constant clinking of iron from the soldiers' ledgers and inkpots. The Ottomans called this processing, not punishment, but every mile was a lesson, obedience through exhaustion. By the second day, the sun had turned merciless. Sister Irene, 62 years old, her knees ruined from decades of kneeling in prayer, stumbled and fell. Two younger sisters, Magdalena and Anna, tried to lift her. The soldiers watched but didn't help. The empire valued observation more than compassion. For 3 miles, the girls carried her between them until her legs stopped moving altogether. When they finally halted for the night, Irene's breathing had gone shallow, her eyes fixed on something beyond the stars. By morning, she was still. They buried her by the roadside with their hands. No tools, no rites, only whispered psalms carried off by the wind. Hassan Pasha watched the burial in silence. Then he opened his ledger and wrote Subject 1 deceased, remaining 22. He did not record her name. The empire didn't deal in names anymore, only numbers. On the 4th day, it happened again. Sister Callista, who hadn't spoken since the siege, stopped walking. She sank to her knees in the middle of the road, eyes closed, lips moving without sound. The soldiers circled, waiting for orders. Hassan didn't give any. After a long silence, he turned his horse and kept moving. The column followed. Callista stayed behind, her body folding into the dust. By the 7th day, only 18 women remained, but something had changed. Their silence no longer sounded like despair. It was focus, the kind of quiet that comes after choice. The calm of people who no longer hope for rescue, only meaning. Magdalena walked at the rear, her steps steady, her gaze forward. She had carried Irene, comforted the novices, whispered psalms until her throat bled. Now, even her prayers had become internal. Not words, but rhythm, a heartbeat that refused to sync with the empire's. Hassan Pasha noticed it too. Every time he looked back, he saw the same thing. Women who should have broken long ago, still walking. The Ottoman machine could quantify everything: land, taxes, livestock. But it had no measurement for endurance. On the morning of the 7th day, he called for Sister Elani. The guards untied her from the line and led her to his tent. What happened next is not recorded in Ottoman archives. Those ledgers, meticulous as they were, leave deliberate silences. But in 2003, a letter was discovered in the archives of Dubrovnik, written by a Venetian merchant who witnessed the aftermath. I saw them bring her back at dawn. He wrote, she could not walk. Her eyes, God forgive me, her eyes were open, but she was not inside them anymore. They dressed her in silk and paraded her through the camp as a convert. But when I passed close, I saw her lips moving. She was still praying, silently, in Latin. She had not broken. They had simply taken her body and left her soul wandering. This was the Ottoman genius, not conquest, but transformation. They didn't need martyrs. Martyrs inspire songs. They needed ghosts, living warnings that faith could be broken without bloodshed. When Elani returned to the group, the other sisters fell silent. The younger ones cried. The older ones simply prayed harder. She never spoke again, never met anyone's eyes. She walked with them the rest of the way to the coast, her wrists still bound, her body present, her spirit elsewhere. At dusk on the 8th day, they reached the port of Volos. The sea spread before them, vast, indifferent, shimmering under the sunset like liquid bronze. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen the ocean. Hassan dismounted, scanning the harbour. Waiting at the pier was a galley, its hull black with tar, oars like ribs, jutting from its sides. The kind of ship built not for trade, but for control. Chains clanked as the sisters were led aboard. They were seated in rows, wrists locked to iron rings bolted into the benches. The smell of salt and rust filled their lungs. On a nearby crate, a clerk copied their information into a manifest. Religious captives, female. 18. Destination, imperial household. Purpose, domestic service and conversion. That single word, service, carried centuries of meaning. As the ship pulled away from shore, the wind howled through the rigging. The sisters prayed, not for rescue, but for remembrance. The water mirrored the crimson sky, a reflection of the empire they were being delivered into. By midnight, Thessaly was gone. The bell tower that once marked their prayers was now just a black speck, swallowed by the horizon. The soldiers on deck sang Ottoman marching songs. The sisters below whispered psalms, two different kinds of empire, two different kinds of order. One written in ink, the other carved into faith. Sister Magdalena leaned against the wood, her wrists raw, her breath shallow. She closed her eyes and whispered, Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. It was not a prayer, it was a statement, a refusal. The sea roared in reply. The galley groaned as it cut through the Aegean, its hull creaking like a living thing. The sisters sat chained to benches below deck, backs pressed against the planks, wrists cuffed to iron rings that still carried the heat of the sun. They had been loaded aboard at dusk, and now, under a black and indifferent sky, they were nothing more than inventory. Religious captives, female 18. The voyage to Constantinople was meant to last 12 days. For the soldiers, it was routine. For the women, it was a descent. The salt air clawed at their throats. The constant motion left them dizzy, weak, half-conscious. They could not see the sea, only hear it. An endless roar pressing against the sides of the ship, as if the world itself were whispering that there was no way back. On the third night, a storm struck. Waves slammed against the hull, splintering the oars. Water flooded the lower deck, rising to their ankles, then their knees. The soldiers above shouted orders, their torches flaring in the rain. The sisters bowed their heads, bracing as the ship pitched like a dying beast. Sister Magdalena began to pray, not aloud, but in rhythm with the waves. Her lips moved without sound. Those chained beside her, Greeks, Serbs, Italians, prisoners of other forgotten wars, watched her. Even in the chaos, her stillness radiated something they could not name. When lightning split the sky, its flash illuminated her face, mud-streaked, eyes closed, but calm. In that moment, one prisoner later recalled in a smuggled note, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. When the storm finally broke, the air reeked of vomit and brine. The youngest sisters trembled, their fingers white from gripping rusted chains. One whispered, "Perhaps this is hell." Sister Theodorus, her voice thin with age, replied, "If it is, then it cannot last forever." Hassan Pasha remained on deck, writing by lamplight even as the rain fell. His ledger was never far from his hand. Every loss, every ration, every soul, recorded, reduced, defined. When he turned the page, he paused, glancing toward the hatch below where the captives lay. He could hear faint murmurs, a psalm rising beneath the thunder. For a brief moment, his pen hesitated. Then he wrote, "Resistance sustained, conversion unlikely." On the seventh day, the sea calmed. The sisters were given thin soup, salt water, and bone, and a strip of bread so hard it cut their gums. The soldiers mocked them, calling them wives of ghosts. Magdalena ignored them. She whispered to the others, "This pain is only time measuring itself." At night, she prayed again. This time, her voice was audible, a low hum that spread through the hold like smoke. The other captives turned their heads, drawn by something they did not understand. She was not praying for deliverance, but for endurance. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, a Greek prisoner joined in, his voice cracked and broken. Then another. Soon, a dozen voices echoed the same verse in their own languages. The ship's walls carried it upward, blending with the sound of the wind until even the guards fell silent. Faith, stripped of ceremony, became vibration, a defiance carried on air and wood. By the 10th day, the women had stopped counting hours. Hunger and sea had blurred everything into one continuous ache. Magdalena's wrists bled from the irons, but she kept her head raised. She had stopped feeling fear. The sea had taken it. At dawn on the 12th day, the shouting began. "Land!" The sisters lifted their heads, blinking through exhaustion. Through the open hatch, they saw it, rising like a mirage from the mist. Constantinople, the city of the world's desire. Its skyline pierced the horizon. Domes, minarets, spires gilded by the morning sun. For centuries, it had been a promise. Now, it was a prison. The galley drifted into the Bosphorus. From the deck, the sisters saw fishermen, merchants, and soldiers lining the harbour. Some pointed, others stared. Even in a city built on conquest, the sight of Christian nuns in chains was rare enough to draw silence. Hassan Pasha disembarked first, handing the manifest to an officer waiting at the pier. The clerk glanced over it, nodding with bureaucratic indifference. Religious captives, female, 18, destination, imperial household. That word again, household. A phrase that could mean anything from service to servitude, devotion to disappearance. The sisters were marched through the narrow streets, the sound of chains clattering against cobblestones. The city surrounded them. Market stalls bursting with spice and silk, the air thick with incense and smoke. But for the nuns, every sound was foreign, every eye a weight. They passed the ancient walls that had once guarded emperors. They walked through the imperial district, where fountains sang and peacocks screamed. And then, as the sun climbed higher, they reached the heart of the city, the Hagia Sophia. Once, it had been the holiest cathedral in Christendom. Now it was a mosque. The cross above its dome was gone, replaced by the crescent. The golden mosaics that once depicted saints and angels were buried beneath plaster, muted but not destroyed, only waiting. The soldiers ordered the sisters to kneel. As the call to prayer echoed from the minarets, one of them whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." The sound of the muezzin rolled through the air, solemn and magnificent. For a moment, even the Ottomans fell quiet. Then the march resumed. But they did not ascend toward the palace's marble halls or sunlit courtyards. They descended, down stone steps that spiraled into the earth. The air grew colder, thicker. The smell of salt and decay replaced the perfume of the gardens. Lanterns flickered against walls slick with condensation. The sound of the sea above faded, replaced by dripping water and the shuffle of footsteps. The tunnels twisted like veins beneath the palace, leading deeper into shadow. At last, the guards stopped before a set of iron doors. Hassan spoke briefly to the officer beside him. The door groaned open. Inside was darkness. The sisters stepped forward, the last of the sunlight dying on their faces as the doors closed behind them. No one spoke. Somewhere above, the Empire celebrated another day of order. And below, in a room that history would one day forget, 18 women took their first breath as prisoners of faith. They were not taken to the palace's marble halls or the chambers of diplomacy where ambassadors bargained over borders. The nuns of St. Catherine were led beneath all of it, down past layers of empire into the earth itself. The descent seemed endless. The air thickened with damp and rot. Torches flickered against stone carved long before the Ottomans ruled these lands. The soldiers said nothing. Their boots echoed like metronomes of inevitability. At the bottom, iron doors opened with a groan that sounded almost alive. Inside, the darkness felt ancient. This was not a dungeon, not officially. It didn't exist on any palace blueprint. It was a service corridor, a storage space, a void repurposed by necessity. But in empires, the unofficial rooms are always the most honest. A clerk took notes as the sisters were herded in. Religious captives, female, total 18. He paused, then added a line that turned the page into prophecy. Temporary assignment, domestic training. And that word, training, was another Ottoman euphemism. It meant assimilation, obedience, the slow grinding down of identity until memory itself bowed to the ledger. The women were divided into groups of 6. Some were sent to scrub palace floors. Others were assigned to laundries and kitchens. The youngest were placed near the harem, not as companions, but as servants who would see everything and say nothing. Days blurred into months. The empire's power was not in its violence, but in its patience. Conquest had been swift. Erasure took time. Sister Magdalena became a washerwoman. She cleaned silks she would never wear and polished silver she would never touch. Each night she returned to the same cold cell beneath the earth, where the air smelled of smoke, iron, and faint traces of seawater. She had stopped expecting rescue, but she hadn't stopped praying. One evening, while carrying a basket of linens through a forgotten passage, she noticed something strange, a faint draft where the wall should have been solid. She pressed her hand against it. The stone felt loose. Later, when the palace slept, she returned with a shard of pottery and began to dig. Behind the wall was a small hollow space, barely large enough for 3 people to kneel. The floor was uneven, the ceiling low, the air heavy with silence. But it was empty, clean, unclaimed, free. The next night, she brought the others. Sister Theodorus, old but unbending, led the first prayer. No candles, no altar, only memory. The words came haltingly at first, verses recalled from decades of devotion, reshaped by need. They began to meet there every night. What started as 3 became 6, then 12. They came after the palace slept, moving like ghosts through the corridors. They whispered psalms so quietly the stone barely caught them. When one sister died from exhaustion, they carved a small cross into the wall with a broken spoon, and then another, and another. Over time, the walls filled with marks, crude, uneven, sacred. Each cross a declaration that they still existed. Each scratch a rebellion against the silence the empire demanded. Years later, archaeologists would count over 40 of them. The women began to call the hidden space their chapel. They stole crumbs of bread from the kitchens and drops of water from the wells to hold secret communion. One night, Sister Magdalena fashioned a cross from a shard of mirror, its jagged edge catching the torchlight like a blade. They prayed not for salvation, but for witness. Above them, the Sultan's court thrived. New viziers rose, old ones fell. Empires rotated as easily as seasons. No one remembered the nuns. No one asked. To the ledgers, they were converted servants, an administrative success. But the stone remembered. In 2011, restoration workers clearing an old section beneath Topkapi Palace would break through a false wall and find the chapel again. On those stones, scratched into eternity, were the same crosses. And beneath them, 4 words in Latin: Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. Those words had survived floods, collapse, fire, empire. The archaeologists would find traces of wax mixed with herbs, evidence of candles made by hand, the kind once crafted in convents, which meant the prayers had lasted longer than anyone imagined. Months, maybe years. But for now, back in 1471, Magdalena and her sisters still knelt in the dark. Their voices rose softly, a harmony built of exhaustion and defiance. They could not see the stars, but they remembered how they sounded when light touched the bell tower at dawn. And so they sang, not hymns of triumph, but hymns of persistence. Each note a refusal, each prayer a record the empire could never erase. Above, the city of the world's desire slept in peace, unaware that beneath its marble foundations, faith was still alive, scratching its survival into stone. Time lost its edges in the tunnels. No sunrise, no sunset, only the rhythm of work and prayer. The sisters no longer measured days by bells or seasons, but by the number of new marks carved into the wall. The empire above them ruled continents, yet beneath its marble heart, 18 women measured eternity in scratches of faith. By the second year, their secret chapel had become more than refuge. It was memory, alive and breathing. The walls themselves had begun to shimmer faintly, the limestone polished smooth by years of fingers tracing crosses in the dark. When the palace guards passed overhead, their footsteps echoed like thunder. But here, beneath the empire's weight, the air trembled with something holier than fear: continuity. They prayed not aloud, but in murmurs, the words of the psalms twisted by exhaustion and hunger into something deeper. Even in darkness, he hears. Each night they gathered after the palace slept, when the kitchens fell quiet and the scent of smoke faded from the halls. Sister Magdalena led them now. Her hands were blistered and raw, her voice hoarse, but her presence commanded silence. She was the youngest, yet something in her had hardened into leadership. She would touch the carved crosses each night and whisper, "This is how we remember." Then she'd guide the others into prayer, not in Latin anymore, not exactly. The words had begun to blend with Greek, with whispers of Turkish and fragments of hymns remembered from childhood, a language of survival. One night, she brought a piece of cloth, a scrap of linen from the laundry, embroidered once with Ottoman patterns. She tore it into strips and laid them across the small ledge that served as their altar. Then, from a shard of a broken mirror, she crafted a crude cross. The reflection it caught was faint, distorted, but it gleamed. It became their centerpiece. Each woman, before leaving the chapel, would touch it once, as if transferring what little strength she had left into that sliver of light. The reflection would flicker across their faces like a blessing, then vanish into the dark. Rumors began to circulate in the palace. Servants spoke of strange noises from the tunnels, of soft voices singing in a foreign tongue. Some claimed to hear weeping. Others swore they saw candlelight moving behind sealed walls. A Venetian prisoner, held for ransom in 1478, would later write of voices beneath the harem, women singing to a god who is not ours. Historians dismissed it as imagination, but he had heard them, the Sisters of St. Catherine, still praying where no light reached. But endurance has a cost. By the 5th year, their numbers had thinned. Hunger, fever, exhaustion. No empire needed to kill them. Time did the work. Sister Theodoris, the eldest, was the first to fall. Her breath slowed during prayer, her head bowing mid-verse. They buried her in the far corner of the room, wrapping her body in linen stolen from the kitchens, whispering the words, "Lux in tenebris lucet." The light shines in the darkness. Her death did not break them. It baptized them deeper into purpose. Each cross they carved afterward was for someone gone. Soon, the walls became crowded, a mosaic of defiance. Sister Magdalena kept count, 23 lines, one for each of them who had knelt in Thessaly that final morning. But as the years passed, fewer hands remained to finish the lines. 11 were completed. The rest trailed off into nothingness, like prayers caught mid-breath. Still, they gathered. Even when their candles ran out, they learned to pray in total blackness, voices weaving through the dark like threads of memory. Above, the empire continued to flourish. New sultans rose, new decrees were written. The palace expanded, the tunnels were sealed, then forgotten. The world moved on. But below, faith persisted, wordless, invisible, unmeasured. In 2011, when archaeologists broke through the false wall, they would find those same crosses etched into stone, dozens of them overlapping, each carved with fingernails or broken pottery. And near the corner, the faint outline of a bird, Magdalena's mark. Beneath it, 2 words in Greek, barely visible: "We endure." The archaeologists found traces of wax embedded in the stone, candles mixed with herbs, not the kind used in Ottoman rituals, but convent candles. This meant the prayers had lasted for years, maybe decades. The world above had long forgotten them, but the stone had not. For all the empire's brilliance, the domes, the ledgers, the armies, it was here, in this small, airless room, that its greatest opponent waited, not in rebellion, not in violence, but in faith that refused to die. Magdalena's last act was not a cry for salvation, but a recording. Each mark, each scratch, a message for the future, a warning carved in silence, You can take everything, but you will never own what I carry inside. Centuries later, when the archaeologists brushed the dust from those carvings, they wept, because they understood what the Ottomans never could. That power may erase names, but not meaning. And that sometimes the truest victories are the ones no one hears. Empires do not forget by accident. They forget by design. By 1482, 12 years after the fall of the convent, a single line appeared in an Ottoman administrative record found centuries later in Topkapi Palace. Written in the neat, detached handwriting of a state clerk, it read, "Staff reduction completed, unproductive elements disposed. No names, no context, just a bureaucratic punctuation mark at the end of 18 lives." The nuns of St. Catherine had vanished from history. No burial records, no relics, no petitions from the church. Even the memory of their convent was scrubbed from maps, its stones repurposed for new Ottoman garrisons. The empire had achieved what every conqueror dreams of, not dominance, but silence. And yet, silence is never complete. In the dark beneath the palace, the crosses remained. They had not been broken or erased. The empire simply didn't know they existed. But the act of carving them, of turning faith into inscription, had already reversed the meaning of conquest. The Ottomans wrote ledgers to define ownership. The nuns carved walls to reclaim existence. Two forms of record-keeping, at war across centuries. To the Sultan's accountants, those women were entries to be processed. To themselves, they were still part of an unbroken story stretching back to the Gospels. And though no one above remembered their names, memory has its own physics. It seeks to return. Over the following centuries, fragments of their story surfaced like bones in disturbed earth. In 1712, a French diplomat stationed in Constantinople wrote of a rumor circulating among the older palace servants. On certain nights, he said, if one stood in the lower corridors, the air would grow suddenly cold, and faint singing could be heard. Latin words no one could understand. He dismissed it as superstition, the silly imaginings of uneducated women. But he noted one detail that would prove impossible to ignore. The sound always comes from the old service tunnels, always from below. The empire would fall 2 centuries later, in 1922. Its armies dissolved, its sultans exiled, its flags lowered. But beneath the marble and gold of Topkapi, the marks remained, undisturbed, untouched. And when the archaeologists of 2011 broke through that false wall, they found not ghosts, but evidence. Wax residue from hand-made candles, pollen traces from herbs used in monastic rites, scratches deep enough to suggest repeated carving over years, proof that those women prayed long after they were declared disposed. They had not died quickly. They had persisted slowly. One of the lead archaeologists, Professor Leyla Ertem, described the discovery. We thought it was storage space, but as soon as our light hit the wall, we saw crosses, dozens of them. Then we found the Latin words, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness, and for a moment, the room felt alive again. Those 4 words had survived earthquakes, fires, and regime changes. They had survived centuries of human forgetfulness. They had survived empire. The same empire that melted bells and burned manuscripts could not melt or burn stone. The same bureaucracy that erased names could not erase what was written by fingernails and faith. And in that reversal lay the ultimate irony of history. The Ottomans believed they were recording eternity in ink, but it was the nuns, voiceless, nameless, starving, who had truly written it. Because history is written by the victors, but memory is written by those who endure. The archaeologists catalogued each mark. They found 23 crosses in total, one for every woman who had knelt in Thessaly when the bell rang for the last time. 11 were complete. The rest faded into unfinished scratches as if interrupted mid-prayer. And beside the final one, the mark of Sister Magdalena, the small bird carved into stone, wings half raised, as if about to fly. Beneath it, the two Greek words, Menume Zodanes, we endure. Her handwriting was unsteady, but it was there. For 600 years, empires rose and fell over that same soil. The Ottomans, the Venetians, the nationalists, the modern republic. But none of them ever touched that wall. It was as if the stone itself had decided to protect what the world had forgotten. And when the archaeologists sealed the site again, leaving the crosses preserved under glass, one of them whispered the same phrase that had once been spoken in darkness. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. Because that is the paradox of conquest. You can kill the body, bury the name, rewrite the record, but you cannot silence what is carved to outlast you. The empire's ledgers are dust now. The bell of St. Catherine no longer rings, but the walls still speak. When the archaeologists left the chamber beneath Topkapi Palace, they sealed the entrance behind reinforced glass. The air inside was frozen in time, thick with the scent of dust and salt, the same air those women had breathed 5 centuries before. The lights they installed were dim by design, to preserve what the darkness had guarded for centuries. But even in that faint glow, something extraordinary happened. The crosses, etched by hands that had starved, trembled, and prayed, seemed to shimmer. The carved Latin letters, nearly invisible at first, came alive in the light. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. And for the first time since 1482, the walls spoke again. Dr. Leila Ertem, the lead archaeologist, described it later in her field notes. We realized these carvings were not just records of suffering. They were structured, aligned like constellations. Each cross corresponded to the others, forming a pattern that almost looked deliberate, as though the sisters were mapping their own heaven underground. She didn't say it aloud, but the implication haunted her. The women of St. Catherine had not just prayed, they had composed a message. Months later, when the inscriptions were digitally scanned, researchers discovered microscopic traces of iron under the carvings, particles from blood. The nuns had cut themselves to leave marks deep enough to last. Faith turned into pigment, pain into preservation. The empire that sought to quantify every soul had never understood that suffering could be a kind of authorship. In that room, every cross was a word, every scratch a syllable, every scar a sentence written in flesh and limestone. Even now, historians argue about how long they survived. The wax residues suggest years. The pattern of wear on the floor suggests decades. But time itself doesn't matter. What matters is that they did not stop. Because when people lose everything, home, body, name, their last act of resistance is to leave proof they existed. And they did. The records of the Topkapi archives show no mention of the convent or its captives after 1482. But memory has a strange way of escaping ledgers. A 16th century Ottoman servant wrote in his private diary that, "In the lower halls, I often hear voices of women praying when all others sleep. The guards fear that corridor. They say it belongs to the ghosts of the Christians." Ghosts or not, the voices had survived centuries of forgetting. Over time, that room beneath the palace became an unintended reliquary, a place where an empire that tried to bury faith had accidentally preserved it instead. When visitors now pass through Topkapi's gleaming courtyards, admiring its fountains and gold mosaics, few realize what lies below. The tour guides speak of sultans and viziers, of harems and intrigue, but never of the 18 women who prayed where the empire could not hear them. And yet, the stones whisper. The faint Latin inscription, the only one ever found in Ottoman royal grounds, has become a quiet pilgrimage site for historians, priests, and those who still believe that memory is a form of resurrection. Some leave candles, some leave flowers, others leave small slips of paper with the same 4 words written in trembling script: Lux in tenebris lucet. For modern scholars, it became more than translation. It became testimony. Because the story of the nuns is not just a story of loss. It is the anatomy of what happens when power tries to erase the soul and fails. When Sister Magdalena carved her bird into the wall, she wasn't pleading for salvation. She was documenting what endurance looks like when there's nothing left to save. That bird wasn't a symbol of freedom, it was evidence of defiance. Centuries later, one archaeologist found herself staring at it for nearly an hour. She later wrote in her diary, "The bird looks as though it's flying upward, toward a ceiling it will never break. But somehow, you feel it's enough. As if flight doesn't need sky, only intent." And that's the truth the Ottomans never understood. Faith doesn't survive because it's rewarded. It survives because it refuses to be archived. The Sultan's ledgers have rotted. The ink has faded. The empire that claimed to manage eternity is gone. But those scratches, those defiant notations of belief, still speak across 6 centuries, louder than any decree ever issued from the throne above. History remembers empires by their monuments, but memory remembers those who endured beneath them. When you stand before that wall today, it does not feel ancient. It feels immediate, alive. The marks are uneven, desperate, human. And in the center, where Magdalena's bird spreads its faint wings, the stone catches the light and throws it back. So back like breath. The light shines in the darkness, and 500 years later, it still does. The empire is gone. Its banners folded, its palaces turned to museums, its ledgers to dust. Yet the story of the nuns of St. Catherine still whispers through the corridors beneath Topkapi Palace, not as an echo, but as a pulse. Today, tourists walk those halls without realizing they tread above the bones of a story that refused to be erased. Their cameras flash against gold-tiled ceilings, while meters below, the faintest carvings, crosses, a bird, 2 words, still wait in silence. We endure. That's what the Ottomans never understood. Conquest is temporary, but meaning is permanent. In every age, every empire tries the same experiment. Erase a people, their memory, their name, and every time it fails for the same reason. You can burn paper, but not conviction. You can bury voices, but not the will to be heard. You can close the ledger, but the bones still speak. The nuns of St. Catherine were meant to vanish without trace. They were not rebels, soldiers, or queens. They were women who prayed, who gardened, who believed that silence could be holy. Yet, when power tried to weaponize that silence against them, they turned it into scripture. They wrote nothing with ink, yet carved everything into eternity. When archaeologists uncovered the chapel in 2011, one of them reportedly whispered, "They were never gone. They were waiting." And she was right. Those crosses weren't relics, they were messages, passed forward through time, across centuries of noise and forgetting, until someone finally listened. This is the paradox of empire. The greater its ambition to erase, the deeper the mark it leaves of what it tried to destroy. 600 years after Sultan Mehmed's ledgers defined souls as property, the only surviving document of that conquest is the stone that refused to yield. The bell of St. Catherine is gone, but its final echo still vibrates through the dark, the sound of resistance disguised as prayer. When we remember them now, we don't resurrect their tragedy. We fulfill their design, because memory itself is the weapon they left behind. A rebellion written not in war, but in witness. And so, when you hear the Latin words lux in tenebris lucet, you're not just reciting scripture, you're continuing their defiance. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome. In 2011, when archaeologists finally entered that sealed chamber under Topkapi Palace, they didn't find treasure, scrolls, or gold. They found testimony. The air inside was thick, ancient, unbreathable at first. Dust shimmered in their flashlights like ash in the wind. The first cross appeared by accident, a faint shadow caught in the beam of a headlamp. Then another and another. Within minutes, the walls told a story that no book ever had. They found dozens of small, crude carvings, each cross a little different, some deep and deliberate, others faint and shaking. Alongside them, Latin letters etched by trembling hands, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. And below, nearly invisible, two Greek words that had outlived every empire that ruled these stones. Menume zontanes. We endure. One archaeologist cried when she read it. Another said later, it wasn't like finding ruins. It was like hearing someone whisper from behind the wall. And they measured the spacing of the carvings. They were deliberate. Each cross aligned with the next, forming lines that matched the number of women taken from Thessaly in 1470. 23. 11 completed, 12 unfinished. The 12th cross trailed off mid-cut, as though the hand that carved it had stopped breathing halfway through a prayer. Forensic analysis revealed something else. Embedded in the grooves were traces of iron, not from tools, but from blood. These women had carved their faith with their own fingernails, their own skin, their own suffering. 5 centuries earlier, Ottoman clerks had written in perfect ink that these women were disposed. But the walls disagreed. And that is how history was rewritten, not from the top down, but from the underground. Because while the empire above them recorded transactions, the women below recorded existence. One in ledgers, one in stone. One meant to last a generation, the other meant to last forever. When the archaeologists mapped the room, they realized it had been sealed deliberately, not collapsed or forgotten, but hidden. Someone, perhaps a servant or a convert who remembered, had bricked up the entrance to protect what lay inside. And in doing so, they had preserved the only surviving record of the convent of St. Catherine. No archives, no relics, no church survived, only these marks. But those marks became a resurrection. The Turkish government at first treated it as a restoration site. Then, when the inscriptions were identified, the narrative shifted. It was no longer just archaeology, it was a revelation. For a few weeks, news spread quietly among historians. The lost nuns of Thessaly found. But not everyone wanted the story told. To acknowledge it meant admitting that faith had endured where empire had failed. That stone, not steel, had outlasted sovereignty. For a time, access to the chamber was restricted. Officially, it was for preservation. Unofficially, it was to contain something more dangerous than relics: memory. Even now, that room is not on any tourist map. Guides pass over it. The site lies behind a maintenance door in the lower corridors of Topkapi, near the old cistern. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear what the archaeologists described that first night. The faint, hollow resonance of the room when the lights are turned off. A sound like breath. A sound like prayer. It's as if the stone itself still remembers the rhythm of the women who prayed there, night after night, until silence became sacred. And maybe that's the truest punishment for empire. Not rebellion, not revenge, but the quiet persistence of what it tried to erase. Because those who carve their truth into stone are not asking to be saved. They're asking to be found. And after 500 years, they finally were. Centuries after, the bell of St. Catherine cracked, and the empire sealed its victory. A strange reversal took place. The conquerors were forgotten, and the conquered remembered. The Ottoman Empire had once stretched across 3 continents. Its ledgers filled with names, its archives thick with decrees, its palaces gleaming with gold. But when archaeologists uncovered that small hidden room beneath Topkapi, none of that mattered anymore. The ledgers had rotted. The decrees were dust. The empire's triumphs had turned into footnotes. Only the scratches remained. Those crosses, carved in desperation by women who had nothing left, outlasted everything built in marble. Each one was a ledger entry, written by faith itself. The Sultan's accountants recorded obedience. The nuns recorded defiance. And now, half a millennium later, the balance sheet had reversed. Because what empires never understand is that time is a moral editor. It rewrites power into memory and memory into meaning. The Ottomans ruled the world, but the world does not remember their ledgers. It remembers the silence of the women they tried to erase. In that sense, the story of St. Catherine's nuns is not only history, it is prophecy. Every system that believes it can quantify the soul eventually learns the same lesson. That belief cannot be administered, and faith cannot be archived. When the archaeologists brushed the dust from the wall and read the words lux in tenebris lucet, they were not just deciphering Latin. They were fulfilling a covenant. They were the answer to a prayer carved 6 centuries ago. by hands that knew they would never be heard, except by the future. And perhaps that is the meaning of the bird carved beside the final cross, wings half raised, mid-flight, caught forever between ascent and fall. It is not a symbol of freedom, it is the anatomy of memory. It cannot fly, but it refuses to die. That is what endurance looks like. Sister Magdalena didn't know who would find her mark. She didn't need to. Her faith was not in salvation, but in persistence, in the idea that truth, once carved, does not vanish. It waits. Now, every historian who stands in that small chamber breathes the same air she once breathed, sees the same scratches she made, and becomes part of her defiance. Every photograph taken of that wall, every translation of those words, is another act of remembrance, another refusal to let silence win. Because history belongs to the victors, but memory belongs to those who endure. The bell of St. Catherine no longer rings. The convent is gone. The empire that tried to erase them has become a museum. But the message remains. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome. Completed.